So I want to start off with a simple question. Are you in a square peg business? Now, most people are, because that's how you make money. More pegs, more holes, better, faster, cheaper. That's how you beat the competition and win in the marketplace. Now, business school professors have a lot of fancy names for all this stuff, like strategic DNA, core competency, continuous improvement, process optimization. But when your square peg business hits around the whole world, all that stuff really means is you're going to continue to get better and better at a bunch of stuff people care less and less about. What do you do about that? That's a big problem. I mean, that's why good businesses fail. Not because a bunch of smart and ambitious people all of a sudden become stupid and lazy, but because their square peg business hit around the whole world and they lost relevance. It can happen to anybody. No one is immune. No business model is a birthright. And eventually, we're all going to have to figure out what to do about it. So how do you go about that? One thing you can try is to go see what some smart and successful people have to say about the problem. This is Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, very smart guy, runs a fabulous business, obviously. And what he says you need to do is to make everybody accountable for creativity and innovation. Drive creativity and innovation throughout your enterprise. And that makes a lot of sense. And he goes on. He says, the one thing that you don't want to do is to create one of these innovation departments or appoint some vice president of innovation. He says, once you do that, you might as well just put a for sale sign on the door. It's basically over. So it seems simple enough. You need to drive creativity and innovation throughout your enterprise, and don't set up one of these silly little innovation departments. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Google ever got the memo, because that's exactly what they're doing at Google X, what they call their moonshot factory. So now what do? Do you innovate the Apple way or the Google way? Maybe neither. After all, Apple hasn't launched a hit product for probably 10 years. Google, maybe even longer than that. So maybe you have to find your own way, forge your own path, create your own journey. Because the only true certainty is that eventually every square peg business has to compete in a round whole world. And that's a problem that every single enterprise and organization needs to figure out. And the best place to start is by understanding what disruption really looks like. And very often, it looks a lot like this sweet old guy. His name is Charlie Bennett. And besides being a very, very sweet old guy, he's also absolutely brilliant. I mean, Charlie's so smart that when you even mention his name around a lot of other very, very smart people, their eyes just sort of glaze over, because Charlie is truly in a class by himself. Now, when he was growing up back in the 1950s, he was, well, as he put it to me, he was a geek before geeks were cool. So while all the other kids were running around, playing sports, trading baseball cards, what really excited Charlie was Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA. Charlie's a little bit different. So he went to university and he got his degree in biochemistry and then went to Harvard to do his graduate work, where being an exceptional student, James Watson actually chose him to be his teaching assistant. So Charlie spent a lot of time teaching undergraduates how these long strands of RNA would migrate out of the nucleus and meet up with these ribosomes, throw off amino acids, and create the proteins that build structures and regulate processes in every cell in our bodies. I mean, this is high school biology today, but back then, this was very, very cutting-edge stuff. And then one semester, he decided to take an elective course on the theory of computation. And for the first time, he was introduced to the concept of a Turing machine. Long strings of code that go through a single reader and create universal computation. And he thought to himself, hey, that seems a lot like the stuff I'm teaching those kids in Watson's class. And he just thought that was the coolest thing ever. I mean, wow, DNA is some kind of computer. And nature can produce computation all by itself. So Charlie never became a geneticist. He went to work for IBM as a research scientist. And he did some important early work in theoretical areas like reversible computing and some other things. But his big breakthrough came in 1993 when he helped lead something called the quantum teleportation experiment. And this was important for two reasons. First, it helped disprove one of Einstein's last theories, known as the EPR paradox. But second, and perhaps even more importantly, it led Charlie just a few months later to write down his 4 laws of quantum information. And I know that seems incredibly abstract. And it is. But that's what it looks like. That's what disruption looks like. The next big thing always starts out looking like nothing at all. If it was obvious, we wouldn't miss it. And it wouldn't be so dangerous. It wouldn't be disruptive if everybody immediately understood it. So let's bring Charlie's idea into a little bit more focus. This is Jay Gambetta, another obviously much younger scientist at IBM. And he has in his hands there a tablet computer, which is, of course, hundreds of times more powerful than the original Apple Macintosh, even though it's just a fraction of the price, because of something we call Moore's Law, which doubles computing power every 18 to 24 months. It's been going on for decades. But that's not what's special about this picture, not the continuity of that tablet computer, but the discontinuity of what it's connected to, which is a quantum computer that's potentially millions of times more powerful than the technology we have today. So how's that going to affect your business? Well, for starters, it's eventually going to make all our encryption protocols obsolete. So if your business involves any transactions, like selling things to customers or buying things from suppliers, it's going to have a pretty big effect on your business. Not just for starters. Current applications being explored range from artificial intelligence to pharmaceuticals, managing large and complex financial portfolios, material science. But the truth is, we've really barely began to scratch the surface because these things don't work very well yet. They're still just a couple of years off. So let's see where quantum computing fits on the Gartner hype cycle. And I'm sure those of you with telescopic vision have already noticed quantum computing. It's right there, in the middle of like 20 other things. And like all those other things, it's going to get hyped up to the peak of inflated expectations, come crashing down to the trough of disillusionment, and slowly start creeping up the slope of enlightenment until it gets to the plateau of productivity where it will start disrupting our businesses in 5 to 10 years. So I think maybe you can start to see the problem. And by the way, this chart greatly underestimates the problem because Gartner really focuses on information technology. It doesn't really follow all the things going on with genomics and CRISPR and nanotechnology and everything else. So how do you keep track of all this stuff, all this technological advancement? How do you keep track of it all and still do the things you need to run your business? You know, like develop products, service customers, manage employees. The answer is simple. You can't, and you shouldn't even try. But what you can do is focus on problems that you can solve, both out in the marketplace and within your organization. And that's what has the power to transform all this incredible technological advancement from a source of disruption to a source of incredible possibility and opportunity. So how do you go about that? That's what I wanted to know. For most of my career, I managed organizations. And probably like a lot of you, I felt incredible pressure to innovate. But it wasn't so clear how to go about it. It's not that there weren't ideas about innovation. There's plenty of ideas. Disruptive innovation, open innovation, lean startups, design thinking. Everybody had an innovation idea they were pushing, but which was right for my business. They all had success stories and track records, but which would work for me? Instead of a clear framework like we have in other business functions like marketing or finance, there was just this confused jumble. And so that's what set me on the journey that led to my book, Mapping Innovation. I started talking to every great innovator I could find, from huge global corporations to world-class labs, startups of every size and shape you could possibly imagine. What I found is that there's 6 things that great innovators do differently. The first is that they seek out and identify new problems. Now that seems very simple in concept, but in practice, it's actually very, very hard. Because we tend to get pretty busy with the problems that are right in front of us. It's not easy to say, let me go out and find some completely new problem to solve. But the great innovators develop a systematic and disciplined process for identifying new problems. This is Eric Haller. He runs something called Data Labs for Experian, the huge big data company. And what he noticed was his company was getting stuck in their own P&L. By that I mean, anything that couldn't be quantified was an absolute non-starter. And he saw that this was causing Experian to miss out on a lot of opportunities. Because obviously, anything that's truly new doesn't have a track record that you can fit nicely into a business plan. So he created Data Labs, which has no P&L, no revenue targets, nothing like that. What it does have is one simple mission. Go out to customers, find out what problems they need solved. Once they find something promising, they can usually bring back a prototype in 90 days. If the customer likes what they see, they co-create a more complete solution, and eventually it goes back to one of the operational divisions at Experian to be scaled up into a real business. In the past 5 years, Data Labs has launched more than a dozen multi-million-dollar businesses, and it's become an engine of growth for a $4 billion company. IBM has a similar process. They call it Grand Challenges. You've probably heard of the last one, the Jeopardy Grand Challenge, which led to Watson. But they're not looking for problems they can solve in 90 days. They're looking for really tough problems that'll take them years or even decades to solve. And of course, Watson is becoming an engine of growth for IBM. Google's 20% time acts as a human-powered search engine for problems, because they know that if somebody's 20% time project starts attracting lots of people to work on it, it's probably a pretty important and interesting problem. So different organizations have different ways of going about it, but that one core concept stays constant. Seek out new problems and come up with a systematic and disciplined process to do that. Second thing great innovators do differently is they build their game based on their own capabilities, strategy, and culture. To illustrate the point, I want to tell you about this funny little phenomenon that happens in the South Pacific called cargo cults. Has anybody heard of this? Cargo cults? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Oh, good, so it'll be something new for you. So basically what happened is, back during World War II, the military established bases on these remote islands in the South Pacific. And the indigenous people who lived there, they were pre-technological societies. So they didn't know what they were looking at. They just saw a bunch of guys clearing off these long swaths of land. And then they did these elaborate rituals. They marched in formation, and they waved their arms like this. And the most amazing things started happening. These machines appeared in the sky and brought down valuable cargo. And then the war ends, and the soldiers leave. And the cargo stops coming. So they figured, we'll do just what they did. We'll march in formation like this, get some guys, wave some sticks around. But no airplanes ever came. And it seems more than a little bit silly, right? I mean, anybody who thinks waving some sticks around is going to make airplanes appear is missing some very, very fundamental principles of aviation. And of course, we as modern, sophisticated people, we understand you can't just mimic rituals and expect to get results. Or do we really understand that? How often do you see articles like these? 7 innovation secrets of Steve Jobs. How many are going to apply to your business? Maybe some, probably not others. You're still going to have to figure it out. 5 habits that made Elon Musk a great innovator. I don't know about you, I already have my own nasty habits. I don't need to learn Elon Musk's. I'm not saying that articles like these can't be useful. They can. I actually wrote the one on the bottom there, How IBM Innovates. They have a multi-billion-dollar research division that has more Nobel Prize winners than most countries do. How many businesses do you think that applies to? So you can never underestimate the importance of context. That's the mistake Pepsi made with their refresh project. They saw a lot of social crowdsourcing stuff going on. They said, that's really cool. We should do that. And then they said, even better, why don't we cancel our Super Bowl ads, our biggest marketing action of the year, and take the money and put it all into this social crowdsourcing stuff. They were heroes on the marketing blogs. Everybody thought, oh, that's really cool. But then the results came in. It was an absolute disaster. Market share tumbled. They fell to 3rd place in their category for the first time in decades. Because after all, what's a sugar water brand built on excitement and being young and carefree? What's that got to do with a bunch of social crowdsourcing stuff? That's one of the things that made Steve Jobs such an effective innovator. He knew what he was good at, fusing technology and design. There's a lot of things he didn't do. He didn't invest in fundamental research or fundamental technologies. He didn't develop a lot of new business models. But by focusing on that one strength, he built the most valuable company in the world. More recently, his successor, Tim Cook, forged a partnership with IBM. And that's something that Steve Jobs would never do. Possibly could never do. He wasn't very good at partnering. but it fits the strengths of Tim Cook, and it makes a lot of sense, marrying Apple's expertise in design and IBM's expertise in fundamental technologies and enterprises. So the third thing that great innovators do is to match problems with the strategies most likely to solve them. And this is the trap that most organizations they fall into. They marry one particular innovation strategy and they say, this is how we innovate. This is our innovation DNA. Well, that's just choosing the solution even before you know what the problem is. So it's absolutely crucial that we classify problems first. And you do that by asking these two simple questions. How well is the problem defined? And how well is the domain defined? Meaning, how well do we understand the skills needed to solve this problem? Once we do that, we can take this confused jumble of innovation strategies and plot them on this innovation matrix. On the upper right, you have sustaining innovation. That's when we have well-defined problems and well-defined domains. And we can treat that much like conventional strategy. We want to devote resources and manage process. But often one of those elements is missing. On the upper left, we have breakthrough innovation strategies. This is for when we have a really well-defined problem, but nobody can figure out how to solve it. So we have to iterate solution spaces, usually through some sort of open innovation strategy. On the lower right, we have disruptive innovation strategies. These work well when we understand the solutions, but we have to go figure out what the right problem is. And companies like Airbnb and Uber have built fantastic businesses with fairly standard technology, simply by finding a new problem for it to solve. And finally, on the lower left, we have basic research problems. This is when we have poorly defined problems and domains. And this is basic exploration. So we want to probe new spaces and build new connections. Now, one of the most interesting things I found in my research was that this quadrant here, which everybody thinks of is the most speculative, actually turns out to be the closest thing you're going to find to a sure bet. Because every company I looked at that invested in exploration eventually hit on something big. And the return on investment was so massive that it more than made up for the wrong turns in blind alleys. Also found that there are some very, very cheap strategies that you can execute in this quadrant, something we talk a lot about in our workshops. So clearly, each part of the matrix is very different. So it's incredibly important that you know where you are by classifying your problems before you start picking a strategy. Fourth thing that great innovators do differently: leverage platforms to access ecosystems of talent, information, and technology. This is Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, built back in the 1920s. It was an absolute marvel for its age. It was completely vertically integrated. It had its own steel factory, steel foundry. So you could almost literally pump raw materials in one end and get finished product out the other. They don't build car factories like that anymore. Does anybody know why? Anybody want to guess? Because it would be stupid. It would be absolutely dumb. There's not a handful of car companies in the world, there's not a car company in the world that could be competitive in more than a handful of the thousands of components that go into building a modern automobile. That's why we have global supply chains. And it's obvious. Everybody knows that when it comes to manufacturing. But with innovation, we forget. we put ourselves on this island. We say it has to be internal. It's innovation. It needs to be proprietary. We need to be able to own and control it. But innovation isn't about what you own and control. It's about what you can access. That's why it's terribly important that you deploy the entire innovation ecosystem. Vendors, partners, customers, open technologies. Because if not, you're going to be very much like a 1920s era car factory trying to compete in a 21st century market. And that's why great innovators know they need to use platforms to extend their capabilities. Fifth thing great innovators do differently is they transform business models. Now, what do I mean by that? A business model is made up of three components: creating, delivering, and capturing value. You don't need to change the whole thing. Often just changing one or two of those elements can end up in a very disruptive business model. Great example is Netflix. Is Netflix here yet, by the way? Oh, aren't you lucky? I love Netflix. When Netflix started out, before Netflix came along, video rentals were, quite simple. You just went to the store and you picked out what you wanted to rent and you paid your rental fee. Then Netflix came along and they created value much like the traditional video stores did. They rented most of the same movies. But they transformed how they delivered value through people would go to the website and get their video through the mail. And they also transformed how they created value through a subscription model rather than pay per rental. And simply by doing that, they disrupted the entire industry. Most of their former competitors have gone out of business. And they built a pretty good business for themselves. Then later they figured out, hey, we can transform how we create value through original programming. And they built a much better business. Now think about that. Netflix has done an amazing job. It's become a huge global media company. Not with any whiz-bang technology, not with any technical breakthroughs, not even with, some famous creative sage running it, but simply by transforming their business model. The sixth and final thing that great innovators do differently is they build a collaborative culture. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, how can we find more innovative people? How can we get those great innovators into our organization? And my answer is always the same. You don't need great people. You don't need the best people, you need the best teams. The problems we have to solve today are far too complex to be given to some lone genius in a back room somewhere. The journal Nature recently did some studies on this. And what they found was that up until about 1920, most of the papers they published in their scientific journal were by sole authors. But by 1950, that had flipped, and most of the papers were co-authored. Today, the average paper in Nature has 4 times as many authors as it did back then. And it's not unusual to have over 100 authors on a single paper. And the work being done is far more interdisciplinary, and it's done at greater distances. What that means is we need to change our perception of what skills we need. Google did a big research project some years back to find out what made their teams, their best performing teams, what made them different. And what they found was that their best performing teams weren't the ones that had people with the highest IQs or the most advanced degrees. They were the ones that created an environment of psychological safety, where people felt free to voice new ideas without fear of rebuke. Another study done by researchers at MIT and Carnegie Mellon found that teams that speak in roughly equal amounts far outperform teams where one or two people are dominating the conversation. Other research shows that teams that integrate their work far outperform teams that dole out different tasks, work in parallel, and then try and bring it together at the end. And there's studies going back decades that show that the best innovators have better networks. It's not that they know anything, it's not that they know everything, it's that they know who knows. They've built connections, and they always know where to find that little random piece of knowledge or insight they need to solve a problem. So before I finish up, I want to leave you with one final takeaway. And if you remember nothing else I said today, I hope you remember this, because it's the biggest misconception about innovation that there is. And that is that innovation is about ideas. It's not. The truth is, nobody cares what ideas you have. They care what kind of problems you can solve for them. So if you want to innovate, don't look for some great, fantastical idea. Go out, find a good, meaningful problem, and get to work figuring it out. Thank you very much. You can always learn more on my website and my book.
You're going to take some Q&A?
Sure.
Salondan sorularımız varsa alabileceğini söylemişti Greg aslında. Anyone to start with? Then I can have one. I read your book, and in this innovation matrix, actually, how does it really work? I mean, how the organization use those? Does it always work well with those strategies, those domains?
Yeah, there's two problems that people run into with the innovation matrix. The first is that they think that better innovators are in all four quadrants. It doesn't matter how many quadrants you're in. The matrix is just to help you classify problems, to pick strategies. The strategies that are in each quadrant, those are suggestions. They're not dictates. There are some important exceptions when some strategies work in a different quadrant. In my book, I talk about, for instance, IBM and Google often use open innovation as a sustaining strategy rather than a breakthrough strategy, because they have so much technical competency that often it's a better use of their resources to take some technologies and open source them and build a community and let them improve it and free up their best scientists and engineers to work on breakthrough problems. Yeah?
I can ask English. So there is an ongoing study for standardization of innovation process. In European Union released a standard, maybe you know, and ISO International Organization prepares an innovation management standard. So do you think standardization will help innovation further or will limit, let's say, creativity? So what do you think of standardization of innovation management system?
Sounds like a very bad idea. Like I said, innovation is really about solving problems. So that's what you want to focus on, the methods of solving them. I mean, if you just think in terms of lean startup and business model innovation, that's since like 2011 it really got going. That's not so long ago. You know, once you standardize something, well, then who decides when we change those standards? One of the most interesting trends I'm seeing now is what I call a rethinking of the scientific method. It's actually quite interesting. Back in the US, the national, I'm going to take these headphones off because it drives me crazy. Back in the US, the National Cancer Institute instituted this program of the cancer genome map. And they figured they take some of the money that they use for doling out grants, and what they do is they just sequence the genomes of tumors and just give it out online, just to see what would happen. And it unleashed an enormous amount of innovation, especially from smaller labs who couldn't afford to do a lot of this genome sequencing themselves. So instead of the traditional scientific method, where you come up with a hypothesis, you figure out how to test it and make some conclusions and on, these scientists were just querying the database to find correlations and to identify mutations that were common in the same type of cancers. And it's become so enormously successful, they're actually shutting that program down because now every cancer is having its own genome map. Like every cancer program does this. It's become so normal, you don't even you don't need a special program for it. And then partly because of that, material scientists started thinking, oh, maybe we can do our own materials genomes. And so they've started to build these materials genomes. So in terms of developing new materials, which is incredibly expensive because it's very, very trial and error, you can actually use machine learning algorithms to query these enormous databases of materials that have already been tested to be able to find patterns so you can shrink that haystack down. This is all completely new, just really in the past 10 years. But in the next 10 years, it's going to become more and more important activity. Where are you going to get a standard for that? You know, if you had a standard, it wouldn't include that. So that's the type of stuff you have to be wary of. Anybody else? Yes?
Greg, hi, my name is Emre. I'm the founder of Kovan Innovation Agency. I'll respectfully disagree with what you just said about systematic approaches and taking a systematic process, because your item number 1 was telling us to systematically look for problems to solve. So the standards that the gentleman mentioned are processes to take you through the innovation life cycle, yet you still can remain creative following a standard process. So I wouldn't want people to walk away from here thinking that you disagreed with your number 1 principle. So I wanted to give you another chance to elaborate on what you just said.
Well, you are absolutely right. I did say that in the first point, you need a systematic and disciplined process for solving problems. But then in point number 2, I said that you need to build your game plan on your own strategies, capabilities, and culture. There's nothing wrong with developing a systematic process. Standardization across different companies, different organizations, is just very difficult. I say this because after talking to so many different organizations, all of them so successful in all their different ways, they had like nothing in common. I mean, some of these, look at IBM. I mean, it's a big, slow dinosaur of a company, but still manages, it's still on top of the next phase of technology. Things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence and neuromorphic computing and some other stuff. And then you look at Google, it does things completely different. Some companies are agile and nimble. So I don't see, and not only that, you see, I often talk to two different companies in the same industry, both successful, and they're sure that what the other guy's doing is wrong and their approach is better, because they're doing completely opposite things. That's why I'm always suspicious of standardization. If it works for you, fine. Don't make me do it. Any other questions? Well, I'll be around the rest of the day, so if you think of something you want to ask me, I'll be around. And thank you very much for having me.